In September of 9 AD, a Roman general named Publius Quinctilius Varus stood in a narrow forest pass in northern Germania and understood, for the first time in his career, that he had been used. Behind him, stretched through the trees for more than 15 miles, 20,000 soldiers were dying. Not in a battle, not on open ground where Roman discipline could mean something. They were dying in mud that swallowed their boots to the ankle, in rain so heavy it muffled every command and every scream, inside a forest that had been narrowing around them for 3 days like a hand slowly closing into a fist. The men were the 17th Legion, the 18th, and the 19th, 3 of the finest armies Rome had ever put in the field. They had marched out of their summer camp a month earlier, confident, unhurried, carrying the eagle standards that every Roman soldier treated as sacred. Nobody had told them they were already inside a trap. Nobody had told them, because the man who built the trap was riding right beside them. His name was Arminius. He was a Germanic chieftain. He was also a former Roman cavalry officer who had spent years eating at Roman tables, speaking Latin in Roman courts, and learning exactly how a Roman army moved, rested, and broke. He used every single thing he had learned. By the time it was over, those eagle standards were gone. The 17th, the 18th, the 19th, erased from the Roman order of battle, their numbers never given to another legion again. And in Rome, Augustus Caesar reportedly stopped sleeping. He wandered the palace at night, unwashed, his hair uncut for months, beating his head against the walls and repeating the same words. Varus, give me back my legions. He never got them back. That was September of 9 AD. Here is how it began. If you had asked any Roman officer in Germania in the summer of 9 AD whether the conquest was going well, he would have looked at you like you had asked something strange. Of course it was going well. It had been going well for years. The Rhine had served as Rome's eastern border for decades, but Augustus had larger ambitions than borders. His plan was to push Roman authority all the way to the Elbe River, to fold the Germanic territories into the empire, the same way Rome had folded in Gaul, in Spain, in Syria. By 9 AD, that plan looked like it was working. Roman roads were being cut through the forest. Roman courts were hearing Germanic disputes. Roman tax collectors moved through the villages, assessing property and recording names in Latin ledgers. Germanic nobles were sending their sons to Rome for education. Some of those sons had served in the Roman army, learned to speak Latin without an accent, adopted Roman names, and returned home wearing Roman clothes. The tribes were not being conquered anymore. They were being absorbed. Publius Quinctilius Varus had watched this process as governor of Germania for 2 years, and he was satisfied with what he saw. Varus was 60 years old, experienced, careful, a man who had governed Syria successfully and understood how provinces worked. You established Roman law, you collected Roman taxes, you rewarded cooperation and punished resistance, and eventually the territory stopped being a problem. He applied exactly that logic to Germania, and to his eyes, it was working. This was his mistake. Not a military mistake, not a failure of tactics or intelligence, a failure of imagination. Varus looked at Germanic leaders speaking Latin, attending Roman dinners, laughing at Roman jokes, and he saw men who had become Roman. What he could not see, what he refused to see, even when people tried to tell him, was that some of those men were learning from Rome specifically in order to destroy it. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where the story actually begins. His name at birth was something the Romans never bothered to record correctly. They called him Arminius. He was 25 years old in 9 AD, the eldest son of a Cherusci chieftain named Segamer, and he had spent nearly his entire life inside the Roman system. He had not arrived voluntarily. When Arminius was a boy, 7 or 8 years old, his father handed him over to Rome as a hostage. This was standard Roman practice. Take noble children from newly absorbed territories, raise them in Roman households, give them Roman education, Roman names, Roman habits of thought, then send them home. The idea was that they would return as natural bridges between Rome and their people, the empire's most efficient pacification tool. For most men who went through that process, it worked exactly as Rome intended. For Arminius, Rome trained the one person capable of destroying it. He rose quickly. He learned Latin so completely that Romans forgot he had not grown up speaking it. He studied Roman military tactics, march discipline, camp construction, and supply logistics, not as a student memorizing lessons, but as someone taking careful, specific notes for reasons he kept entirely to himself. He commanded Roman auxiliary cavalry in the Pannonian campaigns, proved himself in the field, earned Roman citizenship, and reached the rank of equestrian, a social standing that most Roman families spent generations working toward. He did it in a decade. Then, around 8 AD, Arminius went home. What happened to him there is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he came back from Rome carrying something most men who make that journey never bring with them. Not admiration, not loyalty. Rage. Not the hot, impulsive kind that burns itself out in an afternoon. The cold kind. The kind that sits perfectly still and waits for exactly the right moment. He became a trusted figure in Varus's circle, attending Roman dinners, advising on tribal affairs, helping the governor understand which Germanic chieftains could be relied upon and which could not. Varus genuinely liked him. The night before the ambush, Arminius sat at Varus's table, ate his food, drank his wine, and listened to the general talk confidently about the future of the province. He said nothing about what was coming with the morning. That absolute, practiced stillness, that was the most Roman thing about him. The plan Arminius built over the preceding months was a work of precise, patient engineering. And the key to understanding it is understanding what he knew that no Germanic warrior before him had ever known. He knew how a Roman army moved. A Roman column of 20,000 soldiers, 3 full legions plus auxiliaries, cavalry, artillery, and the enormous baggage train that followed every Roman force did not move like an army. It moved like a city. At full march, a force that size stretched for 15 miles. The front was already making camp before the rear had finished breaking theirs. Communications ran through runners who could be intercepted, killed, or simply swallowed by the noise of a forest in a rainstorm. The column could not fight in that configuration. It needed open ground to form into battle lines, time to deploy, and room to maneuver. In a dense forest, on a narrow track, in the rain, it had none of those things. Arminius had watched Roman armies operate for a decade. He understood this vulnerability the way a surgeon understands anatomy, precisely, without sentiment. His plan had 3 parts. First, manufacture a reason for Varus to march. A false report of a tribal uprising to the west, just serious enough to demand a military response, not serious enough to seem suspicious. Varus would take his legions out of their summer camp, move toward the supposed disturbance, and commit his column to a specific route through the Teutoburg Forest. Second, that route. A narrow corridor where the track pressed between steep ridges and marshy ground, with no room to deploy, no room to retreat, and no way to see what waited in the trees above. Third, the trees themselves. For weeks, Germanic warriors had been building concealed earthworks along the ridgelines, low berms of packed earth and timber that would give them elevated firing positions directly above the Roman march route. Not a shield wall, not an open charge, a corridor that the Romans would walk into themselves. On paper, it was perfect. On the ground, it was about to be tested against 20,000 trained soldiers who would not stop fighting just because the situation was hopeless. There was one more detail. Arminius would ride out with Varus's column when it left camp. Trusted advisor, familiar face, exactly where the general expected him to be. He knew precisely where he would be when the killing started, and it was not next to Varus. The morning the column marched out of camp, everything felt like routine. That is what makes this part of the story so hard to watch. There was no dramatic shift, no visible danger, no sign that the largest military catastrophe in Roman history was about to begin. There was only a Roman army doing what Roman armies did, breaking camp at dawn, forming into column, and moving. The sound of it would have been extraordinary. 80,000 boots on hard ground, the creak of wagon axles under loads of artillery, millstones, and medical equipment, the constant metallic jingle of lorica segmentata, the segmented plate armor Roman legionaries wore, each piece connected by leather straps that produced a low, rhythmic clatter with every step. Mules, officers' baggage. The flat, continuous murmur of 20,000 men moving and talking and complaining about the weather, which had been turning gray for days. Varus rode near the front. He had dismissed Segesti's warning the night before. The old chieftain had come to him directly, told him that Arminius was planning a conspiracy, that the march was a trap, that Varus should arrest Arminius immediately and hold the column in camp. Varus had listened carefully and concluded that Segestes was using him to settle a personal grievance. Arminius had married Segesti's daughter against his wishes. This was a family dispute dressed up as military intelligence. He let it go. He let Arminius ride beside him the next morning and said nothing about the conversation. As the column entered the forest, the track narrowed. Expected, the route ran through heavy woodland before opening on the other side. The baggage wagons slowed on the softening ground. The column began to stretch. Officers tightened pace at the front, which only pulled the rear further behind. Then, gradually, the Germanic warriors riding with the column began to peel away, one group at a time. Quiet departures, almost invisible in the noise of 20,000 people in motion. They told Varus's officers they were riding ahead to rally their own tribal forces, to help suppress the very uprising the column was marching to put down. Several officers noticed. A few mentioned it. Varus told them not to worry. These were allies. This was what allies did. He kept marching north into the trees, and the forest closed behind him, and the track kept narrowing, and the rain began. It started with sound, not the sound of battle, not yet. Something else. A low, rhythmic drumming through the trees above the column, too steady to be thunder, too close to ignore. Then voices, hundreds of them, building into something that did not sound like language. The Germanic baritus, warriors beating weapons against shields and screaming in unison, rose through the rain until it seemed to come from the forest itself. Then the javelins came down from the ridgeline. For a legionary marching in the middle of the column, carrying 60 pounds of armor, weapons, and kit, unable to see more than 30 feet through the rain and the trees pressing in on both sides, the first minutes were almost incomprehensible. Men were falling around him. From where? He could hear screaming ahead and screaming behind, and could not determine which direction the attack was coming from because it was coming from everywhere. From the ridges above, from the tree line to the left, from the swampy ground to the right, where the track had narrowed to barely the width of 2 men walking side by side. He could not form up. There was no room. The men in front of him were pressing backward, and the men behind him were pressing forward, and the centurions' screaming orders were screaming into rain that swallowed sound before it traveled 20 feet. The Romans fought anyway. They pushed toward the ridgelines, tried to lock shields, tried to hold formation on 40-degree slopes covered in wet leaves. Men slipped, men fell. The soldiers behind them stepped over them and kept moving because stopping meant dying. By nightfall of the first day, the Romans had taken catastrophic casualties and gained nothing. Varus ordered camp. They burned their wagons to deny the enemy supplies, built a hasty perimeter in the trees, and tried to count who was still breathing. The second day was worse. The track narrowed further as the column pushed north, pressing the Romans between the ridgeline on the left and bog that swallowed men to the knee on the right. Arminius's earthworks channeled every Roman charge back into the killing ground. Every officer who led men up the slope into the trees disappeared and did not return. The rain did not stop. Shields that had weighed 15 pounds at the start of the march now weighed 30, waterlogged and heavy. Sandals had dissolved in the mud. Men who had fought for 2 days without sleep and almost nothing to eat were being asked to charge uphill into forest against an enemy they could hear but not see. On the third day, the column broke, not all at once. Unit by unit, the formation came apart as men lost sight and sound of everyone around them. A cavalry detachment under an officer named Varus broke away and rode hard for the Rhine. Germanic warriors hunted them down in the trees before they covered 5 miles. The eagle standards, the sacred symbols every legionary had sworn to protect with his life, were going into the forest one by one and not coming back. On the third day, Publius Quinctilius Varus looked at what remained of his army and made a decision. Not a military decision. He had no military options left. He had tried to push north and been driven back. He had tried to hold a perimeter and watched it shrink overnight. He had sent cavalry to break through the encirclement and received no word back. The men still standing around him were exhausted, out of javelins, and bleeding in the mud. At some point, the exact moment is lost, Varus stopped thinking like a commander and started thinking like a Roman. This is worth pausing on because what he did next was not cowardice, even though it looks like it from 2,000 years away. Varus was 60 years old. He had served Rome his entire adult life. He understood with complete clarity what capture meant, not just for him personally, but for the emperor who had trusted him with 3 legions, for the institution that had placed its name behind his judgment. A Roman general displayed and sacrificed at a Germanic altar. Augustus would know. Every Roman in the empire would know. He had already lost the legions. He was not going to give them his humiliation on top of it. He fell on his sword. Several of his senior officers did the same. Others were captured in the days that followed, as the last organized resistance dissolved into the trees. The Germanic tribes did not take prisoners for ransom. They took them for their gods. Roman soldiers who survived the fighting were sacrificed in forest clearings, burned in sacred groves, their skulls nailed to oaks along the pass where the column had come apart. The 3 eagle standards, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, were carried into the forest and placed in Germanic temples. They would not return to Roman hands for decades. Arminius walked through what remained of the Roman camp and found it quiet. The man who had eaten at Varus's table 3 nights earlier stood in the ruins of 3 legions and felt, for the first time since they had taken him from his father as a boy, that he was exactly where he had always been heading. The news reached Rome slowly, carried by survivors who had fought their way out of the forest in 1s and 2s in the days after the collapse. When it arrived, Augustus, by then in his 70s, the most powerful man on earth, a man who had outlasted civil wars and assassinations and the end of the Republic itself, reportedly came apart. He let his hair and beard grow untrimmed for months. He wandered the palace at night. He beat his head against the walls and repeated the same words to empty rooms. "Varus, give me back my legions." He never pushed east of the Rhine again. In the will he wrote before his death in 14 AD, Augustus formally advised his successors to keep the empire within its existing boundaries. The man who had planned to extend Rome's eastern frontier all the way to the Elbe died having accepted that it would stop at the Rhine instead. That border held for 400 years. Think about what that actually meant. The Roman Empire Romanized every territory it controlled. It replaced local languages with Latin, local laws with Roman law, local identities with Roman ones. It happened in Gaul. It happened in Spain. In every place Rome held long enough, Latin won. Germania it never held. The tribes east of the Rhine kept their languages, their customs, their identities. Those languages eventually became German, Dutch, English, and the Scandinavian tongues. If you are watching this in English, you are watching it in a language that exists specifically because 3 Roman legions died in a forest in 9 AD. If Varus had listened to Segestes, if he had arrested Arminius the night before the march, or chosen a different route, or waited one more day in camp, Rome's eastern frontier might have reached the Elbe within a generation. The Germanic tribes would likely have been absorbed the same way the Gauls were. The languages that became English and German would probably have dissolved into Latin the same way the Celtic languages of Gaul dissolved 2,000 years ago, leaving almost no trace behind. None of that happened because of 3 days of rain and mud and a man who spent years learning everything Rome knew and then used it to hollow Rome out from the inside. The 3 legion numbers, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, were never assigned to another Roman unit. In the entire recorded history of the Roman military, that happened exactly once. Rome did not forget. Rome did not forgive. And Rome never went back. The battlefield at Kalkriese sits about 15 miles north of Osnabrück in Lower Saxony, just off a 2-lane road that most people drive past without slowing down. The site is quieter than it should be. There is a museum, a walking path, a metal observation tower from which you can look out over the terrain and understand immediately why Arminius chose this particular ground. To the south, the long slope of the Kalkriese hill, still rising above the pass at the same angle it rose above the Roman column. To the north, the remains of the Great Moor, the boggy ground that pressed the column against the slope and gave the Romans nowhere to go. The pass between them is narrow. Standing in it, you feel the walls closing in, the way the ground tightens on both sides, the way the trees above seem to lean inward. In the soil here, archaeologists have found Roman coins, fragments of segmented armor, cavalry harness fittings, and the bones of men and mules that were never buried. They found a Roman cavalry parade mask, an ornate iron faceplate, the kind an officer wore for ceremonial display, lying in the ground where it had been dropped or ripped away 2,000 years ago. It sits in the museum now, under glass, staring at nothing. You can walk the earthworks Arminius built. Partially reconstructed, they follow the ridgeline above the pass for several hundred yards. Standing on them and looking down at the path below, the geometry of the trap becomes completely clear. You do not need to be a military historian to understand what happened here. You just need to stand where Arminius stood and look down. Arminius did not live long after his victory. He spent the following years fighting Roman punitive expeditions, losing his wife Thusnelda to capture, handed over by her own father Segestes to the Romans, and watching the tribal alliance he had built slowly fracture under peacetime politics. In 21 AD, members of his own tribe assassinated him. Chieftains who had decided he was accumulating too much power. He was 37 years old. Tacitus, the Roman historian, called him the undoubted liberator of Germania, a grudging tribute from the civilization he had broken. There is a statue of Arminius, Hermann in German, on a hilltop near Detmold, not far from the battlefield. Completed in 1875, it stands 53 meters tall, sword raised toward the southwest, toward Rome. Most people driving the highway below do not know his name. He was a hostage who became an officer, a Roman ally who became Rome's nightmare. A man the empire educated, trained, decorated, and trusted, and who used every single thing Rome gave him to ensure that Rome would never cross the Rhine again. The empire that spent 5 centuries teaching the world how to be conquered never considered what would happen when the lesson finally went the other way.